All right. Um, Emre, can you jump on video?
Awesome.
Um, all right. So usually, I host webinars, or at least, during the pandemic, um, I was sort of an impromptu host for webinars. And we decided for today, since we're focusing on product, that we would actually have um, our head of software product run this particular conversation and interview and sort of demo and whatnot. Um, and with product, I think folks like to talk a lot about like what they imagine for the future, and you probably will hear some stuff about like our history and past. But we also want to show you some stuff. And so if you are here, you will get an early look at what's coming. And obviously, we love questions, feedback, things that you're curious about. So there is a Q&A that is different than the chat. You'll see it sort of at the bottom of Zoom. Just click Q&A and you can toss anything in there, and either Emre or I will like float those questions in live and work them into the discussion. But otherwise, I'm going to sit back and maybe enjoy this a bit and sort of be an attendee, perhaps a panelist, and let Emre take it from here. Emre, do you want to introduce yourself and then we can kick it off?
Yeah, awesome. So great to see so many people in here. I'm Emre. I lead the software product at Density, basically focused on how do we create software interfaces that help people measure and understand space and then improve it from there. So excited to spend some time together with everyone and talk about, cover kind of the story of Density, how we got to today, what we're focused on today, and then kind of some sneak previews, hopefully, that we'll ask for forgiveness from our teams to show just very, bleeding edge and progress work towards the end too. And obviously time for questions. So thank you all for joining us. I think maybe to start, Andrew, would love to pass it to you and just hear a little bit about the journey over the past several years of Density, and maybe kind of how Density started, our mission, and then how that's kind of turned into what we're focused on today.
Sure. So I've told the story a number of times in the past, and so if you've heard this before, please bear with me. I'll try to keep it, try to add some like flair to it. We were trying to figure out how busy our favorite coffee shop was. This is 7 years ago, 7.5 years ago. We were trying to figure out how a small coffee shop called Cafe Kubal was, largely because we wanted to avoid the snow that we were like walking through, which was like 5 blocks in the middle of winter. And then we'd hit this 20-minute line. And in the process of trying to figure out how to solve that problem, we found that there weren't a lot of technologies that could accurately measure humans in space. And so we like worked to build some. And it took us like 3 years before we had like a really reasonable thing. In fact, had I known that it would be this hard to count people in space, had I known how weird people are in physical space, meaning they like bump into each other and they take phone calls and they like bring stuff with them, boxes, bags, and babies and other B letter things, we probably wouldn't have done it. But we're here now, and we've made some sense of human complexity. We are still making sense of human complexity. And along the way, we learned about this extraordinary world called workplace. And one of the reasons I love workplace is because the primary questions are about A/B testing physical space. They're about design and sustainability. They're about productivity and use. And there's hundreds of millions, billions of square feet of space in workplace that are just completely unmeasured. And that's actually how I met you, Emre. Was sort of in the workplace world. And I think, today, sort of fast forward 7.5 years, and I like to joke that we're going to begin and end in coffee shops, but we're going to take this fun little detour in corporate offices. And it's because there's such like a pressing need in that space. And there's such extraordinary compounding positive outcomes for solving that problem in that particular market. And so we recently announced a round that we did. I'm going to shut up in a second, but we recently announced a round that we did, and as a part of that, we we also published what is our sort of publicly stated mission, or what we're trying to do, the impact we're trying to have on things. And it's very simple. Our Density's mission is to measure and improve our footprint on the world. Obviously, we measure the footprints of other folks as they move through space, but we also think that there is a really remarkable opportunity to not only measure how the physical world is used, like the built world is used, to do so, without invading privacy when there's a reasonable expectation of it, but then to actually start to improve how these spaces are designed, how they're built, how they're used, how many are built. And that's a very exciting, I think, long-term outcome if we get it right. So, and software, and what we're going to show today, or I think we're going to talk about today, Emery, an enormous part of this. People don't buy sensors; they're trying to buy or understand outcomes in their space, which ultimately is an interface.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things for me about this is, like, we have these primitives for how we A/B test and iterate on software, or A/B test and iterate on hardware. But then we work and live in physical space that, for basically since the start of time, has never really been measured well, and that makes it really hard to then iterate and improve and both manage the footprint of the space and its environmental impact, also the productivity of employees in the space. So building on that, I kind of want to zoom in, Andrew, on this idea of A/B testing in physical space, and would love for you to walk through, what does that really mean? And as we talk to all of our customers and different partners and just design partners or people in the industry, how is that translating into solving kind of the top of mind problems today, as we've gone through this pandemic shift and are now figuring out what the future looks like?
Well, A/B testing, is maybe a technical term for it, but I think it's something that the industry has been doing for a long time. You design a space, and then you see how people use it, and then you take that feedback and learnings, and you apply it to maybe your next building or your next space or your next team. Workplace admins, portfolio admins, heads of real estate, workplace teams, they've been doing this for a long time. We're not inventing anything new there. I think that the only thing that maybe is different now is it being less observational data, less study-based data, temporary studies, less anecdotal, and more just data informed discussion. So same conversations are happening, same testing is happening, except now, you can actually have a system tell you, which spaces are most performant relative to a goal, which spaces are least performant relative to a goal. And I think that marks a fundamental shift in how buildings will be designed and used, when everyone sort of is working off the same data set, instead of kind of what can feel sometimes like the political movements of who has sway and budget and so forth to make these decisions. And then as it relates to your question about the pandemic, people have been modernizing buildings and the infrastructure of buildings for half a decade. The concept of smart buildings has been around for 15 years, maybe longer. We've been talking about trying to make buildings more responsive to the humans in it. And I think the pandemic has accelerated the timeline. So it's not something that Density has invented, or that the vendors in our space have invented. This is something that has been, the industry has been working to try to do for a long time. It's just that the pandemic has made fundamentally clear how blind we are to the actual use of space. We all are, how blind we are without measurement, which is why our primary focus or mission is to begin with measurement and to end with improvement.
Awesome. I think what's really interesting, and to everyone here, we've talked to a lot of you, and Andrew and I have been having conversations with a bunch of different partners and customers. And what's really fascinating is this, how different teams are approaching what the future post-COVID floor plan looks like, and how, basically being able to understand and benchmark different types of spaces and try those out and then roll them out. And then now basically had a direct feedback loop on if you're testing something in the space, like what's the ground truth of how that space is actually being used.
One of the other things, can I just add, like,
yeah.
One of the other things that's cool is safety was like a really important thing for it's always an important thing, but it became like the forefront of everyone's discussion, like during all of 2020 after like March. Safety in the space, social distancing in the space, mask wearing, being able to cleaning policies. What's so interesting about that is that like elevated the folks in workplace to having conversations, like daily conversations with C-level folks about the strategy of the company, because your safety policy would impact how often people might show up or whether or not they would get sick. And I think what's so remarkable is that trend has persisted. It's just morphed from safety into the design and use of space, the design, use, and allocation of space. It's almost like the thing that architects, designers, and real estate professionals have essentially been talking about for years, sort of is now sort of at the forefront of a lot of these discussions. There's a question from Pete about, can you cover real ROI for your system and product? Case study example is fine, but real numbers would be appreciated. Yeah. So we worked with an organization who noticed that their peak utilization was in like one of their primary offices was no greater than, I believe it was like 37% utilized. Sort of like peak utilization was 37%. They had, as an average, they had a couple days that were at like 90%, but they were typically offsite. And this extremely low 37% utilization or near 40% utilization at their busiest moment on average, simultaneous occupancy, meant they could walk away from a lease that they were about to sign about 5 days later. And they walked away from the lease, and I believe they saved $5 million over a 5-year term. We got a phone call and said, hey, we'd like to deploy nationally. And we're now in sort of all of their buildings across the US. It's 50 metros, 70 buildings, 120 floors, if I'm remembering correctly. And I believe the cost of the program that helped them identify peak utilization was around $50,000 or $60,000 all in. That was their pilot. And so I'd say the lease avoidance, as opposed to just consolidation, lease avoidance is a very fast, direct return on investment. Emery, I'll kind of kick it back to you.
Yeah. And Pete, kind of to just like build on that too, I think there's like two really tangible use cases for us. Like one is just instrumenting your portfolio in space and then using that to right size your footprint. So kind of like what Andrew just described of, do you have too much space in an area? Do you have not enough space? Is a business unit coming to you and then asking you for more space and you want to validate it? So that kind of ties into this idea of cost. And like Andrew said, it's really tangible, given that your real estate footprint as a large company is probably your second biggest expense after your people. So that's kind of one. And then second set of use cases are around more productivity, like how as a company can you enable employees to be productive in space, and like what does that look like, and how do you find the balance of having enough space for people, but not too much space. But you also, as we talk to companies, you don't want your spaces to be packed where there's this perception where employees can't find the right spaces for the types of work they want to do when they go into the office. So those are the two tracks that I think about. And that kind of ties to this other question that we got around what types of organizations have been buying density. Is it real estate owners, property management, office, commercial renters? So Andrew, maybe I'll pass that off to you of like, what
Sure.
are the types of discussions we're having, and yeah, who do we work with?
Yeah, our primary focus is on the end tenants, so the people that are in the space. So vast majority of the people that we work with and buy our product are organizations that are actually occupying the space as opposed to owning the building. They might be owner occupiers, which is typically a percentage of a large company's real estate is owned and a portion is leased. So they may be owner occupiers, but we don't specifically go after owners. And the reason we tend not to go after owners, at least at the moment, is because ultimately the folks that are benefiting from the outcomes, like the fundamental set of folks or problems that are being solved really are the folks that are managing the space, in the space, using the space each day. I do think in the future, owners, there's a lot of upside to understanding how a building that I own or a building that you own is being used, particularly as you're thinking about marketability for people that want to lease a space, or if they're outgrowing a space. But primary focus today, 99% of our focus is really on the end tenant. Maybe I can tackle a couple of these others and then we can keep on rolling, Emre. How many density sensors do you sell annually? We don't publish that number publicly, but we sell a lot of sensors. And I should say open area and entries mix is also interesting, depending on your goals. With the question is sort of referring to one of our hardware product lines, which is a system that can be deployed. It's called entry, and it does what it says it does, which is being deployed at a point of entry. It typically gives you building and floor level occupancy, simultaneous occupancy. And to James's question about accuracy and setting it up with multiple doors to the building, you can essentially think of like entry as if you've got 5 points of entry into a building, then you install it at each of those points of entry, and that can reconcile count for the building. Same thing with a floor. If you've got 3 entrances to a floor, you have an entry system at each of the points of entry that gives you or allows us to calculate real-time occupancy on the floor level. Open area, which is our hardware product, goes into unbounded space. So the desk that I'm sitting at now, a workstation that someone's at, spaces that are essentially open, even small conference rooms. We use this radar product, open area, to measure space. And we're actually going to show you some of that, I think, today and in our software. As to accuracy, I would say that entry, when we talk about accuracy, the most important thing that we focus on is reliability. Accuracy is an input to whether or not a technology of any kind is reliably solving a use case. So, and I can talk at length about accuracy, but I think the thing that's really important predominantly for our customers is, does this system reliably solve for the use case that I'm trying to achieve? So if I'm trying to understand utilization and return to office, how many people are actually coming back relative to the capacity that I designed a building for, entry can reliably provide for you simultaneous occupancy across the building and floor level use case. Open area can reliably give you data about utilization of people at workstations or in small spaces or in open areas, whether that's dwell time. By the way, all of these things are available in a spectrum. So like some of the things I'm mentioning are things that are available in software today, and others will be available in software tomorrow. The goal is to be able to give you as perfect information as we can, but as reliable information as we can on utilization of space relative to capacity, linger time or dwell time. So are people focusing there? Are they congregating as a group? Generally, utilization against target. So you've designed a space for something. Is it actually being used for that thing? Or is it not being used at all? And you should be able to ask those questions of your portfolio, much like you would ask any other sort of data system. So you can start to make better decisions about both your real estate strategy and your workplace strategy.
That's awesome. And I kind of want to dive in and show you all some of the product that ties into what Andrew just said. But maybe before we do that, Andrew, on the topic of just like fidelity and like this under the data or the richness of the data that's coming, can you talk a little bit about the signal that would come from using a sensor like density versus like what other methods people may have been using in the past? And I think that might also tee up the product demos that we're going to do.
Yeah. So, the state of the art for the vast majority of, time has been observational studies. So, a person with a clipboard wandering through space, not wandering, but specifically going through space to observe behavior and use, and then providing a report to a customer who then makes decisions based on those observational anecdotes. That room is in use for an hour. It's called bed checks. You sort of wander around, do a bed check. They can be really informative, particularly on like the subjective measure of a space. More modern stuff has been, I guess there's sort of an interim step, which is like passive infrared and active infrared sensors. These are the things that are in your lights. They tell you if there's motion. If you've ever been in a conference room and you sort of like, sort of wave your arms like this, turn the lights back on, that's you interacting with passive infrared sensor. It's sort of got a little IR light on it. And when you wave your arms, you trigger sort of the sensor that can pick up that IR light, which turns on the lights and starts a timer until the lights turn back off if it hasn't seen motion. And we've all sort of experienced the circumstance where it doesn't see motion. They're not super sensitive. They can be affected by a variety of things. And but that was sort of the interim step after sort of just observational studies, which is why observational studies have remained and will remain, I think, long after. But I'd say as one of the reasons why they're not a super reliable technology. Where we are today is a little bit different than where we were. And by the way, these questions are great, so please keep them coming. We'll try to work all of them in. Where we are today is a little bit different. It's markedly different than sort of the class of systems that were active or passive infrared. Today, the vast majority of sort of, I guess, our peer set tend to be other vendors who are building sensing systems of some kind to measure the utilization of stuff. Sometimes that's space, sometimes that's energy, sometimes that's the software associated with allocating space to different teams. Broadly described as sort of like workplace systems, workplace information systems. But your IWMSs fall into this. Your camera technologies fall into this. Density falls into this. And I'd say right now it seems like they tend to fall into two camps. It's either an optical system, a quote unquote optical system, which is a camera, or it's sort of a system like densities, which is not a camera and anonymous at source, meaning you can't reverse engineer, even if you wanted to, who the person is, where they went, what their identity is, and so forth, who they met with. The camera-based systems, and Emre, is this too detailed or is this helpful? Okay. There's sort of two categories of camera systems. There's the low-res systems and there's the high-res systems. I should say low-res systems and res systems. The high-res systems are like your facial recognition. That's like, those tend to take either repurposed security cameras or more often bespoke custom cameras that are actively looking to do continuous monitoring of a space. And those can be super useful in a lot of spaces, can be a bit more challenging in spaces where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. Occupants have a reasonable expectation of privacy, but those technologies are used to do people tracking, essentially in real time. The second category is low-res cameras. Low-res cameras are usually talked about as like optical systems or optical sensors or sensors, and that's because their goal is not to actually capture video. Their goal is to capture utilization data, much like density's goal. That's why they use low-res cameras, is to sort of obscure or try to avoid the concern around PII. The problem with moving down stack to a low-res camera is that you end up typically taking snapshots of whether or not someone's at a desk. So you take photographs of whether or not someone's at a desk, push that to a computer that then does sort of post-processing on that and turns that into utilization data. I think that, that is a way to approach the problem. In our case, we don't ever want to be reverse engineered. And we also build systems that give us not just X and Y, like a camera, like an RGB camera. It gives us X, Y, and Z. So we have depth about how a space is being used. And that can be extremely useful in the precise measurement of use, the real-time and precise measurement of use. And so I think Emre can maybe show some of this, but our open area sensors, for instance, are radar-based, and we get an extraordinary amount of data about how space is being used without knowing gender, age, or ethnicity, which is really hard, but we think worth it in the long term.
I think what's, just to click into this point, what's interesting and resonates to me is like our goal as density is measured of space, and the idea is as a result of that, we can improve the experience of the humans that are actually living and working and commuting in those spaces. And so to do that, because humans are so interesting and do weird things, it's really hard to do and do that with a high degree of fidelity. We also need to think about how do we do that in a way that's not intrusive to the actual human space, that would be counterproductive. And so I think what's interesting for us, just thinking about our roadmap and the product challenges, is by default you can't see humans in space because we're not cameras, and so that creates a whole set of engineering complexity that we deal with and to make that work, and that's very, very critical to maintain that privacy by default and not being able to reverse engineer. So please keep the questions. Oh, go ahead.
If we could, I just want to say we're talking a lot about sensors and technology, and I want to make sure, like, the sensors and technology are interesting, but they almost don't matter provided they can give or check a certain set of boxes around accuracy, real time, sort of what you can measure. The real question is, like, if I want to measure every square foot of space and understand how that is, what does that look like? So Emery, I'd love to move into product demo if we could.
Yeah.
And then it's just a question of, like, at what cost does it take to measure a square foot? Because I think that is substantially more important than what technology you're using, provided it checks a few boxes.
Yeah, so this is kind of a view of the office, our office in San Francisco. I'm sitting in this phone booth, and this is from a couple days ago. So I think maybe to tee this up, and then Andrew, I'll kind of let you dive in, is we're focused on a few key use cases for companies that we work with. One is at the portfolio level, how are buildings performing? That ties into this ROI calculation of, like, do we lease or how do we right size our space that we talked about earlier? The second is on a floor plan, how are humans actually experiencing and using the space? And then how do we use that to A/B test and kind of improve the spaces that we're designing? So this is a snapshot of a heat map from our office from 2 days ago. We're doing an offsite this week, so there are a lot of people in the office. And so Andrew, I'll kind of let you spend a little bit of time talking about this, and then we can zoom into a few of the different, like, hotspots in here and talk about what's going on.
Well, let's just zoom into the whiteboard in the main conference room. So there's a whiteboard right there. You can see in the blue box, it's highlighted on the right wall. You can see sort of folks spending time on that wall during a certain period of time. I guess in this case, it's a full day from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on December 6th. That's people using an amenity, in this case, a whiteboard. You can also see sort of 4 distinct folks. Clearly a meeting was here for a long period of time. And the conference room down in the bottom left was occupied for 82% of the day. So this is 7 hours during this day. This room is doing what it was intended to do, facilitating a particular type of sized team, facilitating what I think is an offsite, but I could be wrong. And happens to have an amenity that someone is actually interacting with, or the team's actually interacting with.
And kind of zooming out and looking at the rest of our office, this is going into this idea of, like, how is the space performing relative to its intent? We see that this room is performing incredibly well today. One thing that happens sometimes is you'll see a large conference room like this with, like, a circle of just one person, usually Andrew, walking around in the space, and that may not be what that room was intended to do. So it's kind of helpful to establish where we are today, and if you want to understand and iterate on your space, like, what's the type of data that density can provide you. I want to take this and go into looking ahead a little bit and talk about how are we kind of building up from here, and what does our product roadmap look like. And so some of the, like, as we think about how do you design workplaces, there's a bunch of different space types and experiments that we hear from companies that they want to run. It may be, do I have the right mix of large conference rooms versus small conference rooms? Maybe I don't know how many people on our sales team are coming back to the office and how they're going to use their neighborhoods. Like, are they spending time at their desks versus are they spending time in rooms? It may be introducing different spaces with the intent to provide space for focus or collaboration, like our lounge area at the bottom left here, and how are those spaces performing. And so our goal over the next kind of few months is to make it really easy to take what you see here and understand, given a capacity for a space, how is it performing relative to its capacity? How long are the humans in the space staying there? For desks, what's the kind of dwell time at a desk on average? Like how long does a person spend at the desk? How many times does that change? Like, do they leave and come back? And that's our, direct focus, and kind of building our way up to being able to roll up and benchmark space at a higher level. So I pulled, and hopefully our design product team doesn't kill me for this, but I pulled the kind of bleeding edge set of designs that our team is working on now of how we go up from what we just showed you, and like build on what we just showed you. And I'll kind of flash that on here. So this is kind of in active development, and it's in Figma, so I think may even get updated as we walk through this. But how we think about like understanding and understanding how space is used at the workplace level is really in creating a navigation system. So just like you would walk through a physical space, we want to let you basically click through spaces and explore your floor plans in our app and understand how is a floor being used and how is a space being used relative to its intent. So what we're seeing here is kind of building on the interface we just saw. We've zoomed into a particular floor. We can see that this floor has capacity of 240, see how long the floor is used, and then we can see the mix of the different types of spaces on the floor. So these are basically labels that you can apply to the spaces. So we have collaboration spaces, really heavy, large amount of focus spaces, spaces to socialize, and then maybe service. And if I click into one of these spaces and I can see Alfred has a really low performance, it's in the bottom 10% relative to all other rooms on this floor. And so I can click into it and understand this room's capacity is 16 people, but it has a very low utilization relative to capacity, and then an average amount of time spent in the room of about an hour. And we can see that in the 16 hours that we're looking at this room, it's only used for 20% of the time. And so from these insights, you can basically copy a link to Alfred, share it out to your workplace team, and convey how this particular space is used. But one of the kind of keys also of like putting Alfred in the context of the broader set of your rooms in your portfolio is the ability to label the room. And so, Andrew, I kind of want to tee up this idea of like, how do we think about labeling, and how is that going to translate into this idea of benchmarking spaces over the next few months to build this out relative to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple points to call out. One, and hopefully to address some of the questions. This is a report showing utilization. This is the result of sensing in software. This is not sort of a report to show you where sensors go. This is just what happens when you've covered all of these space types. So just to clarify. And then the second thing is you'll notice all these little red and green sort of trend lines. When Emre talks about a navigation system and a labeling system, what we're trying to achieve is we want to make it as easy as pinch to zoom in and out of the scope of your portfolio or buildings. You should be able to zoom all the way into a specific space like we did on the previous screen, understand how that space is being used, and even into a specific asset like a whiteboard, and zoom all the way back out to a floor or to a building or to your portfolio or a region even, and understand how these spaces are trending. Now, the question is how they're trending relative to what? Relative to themselves? Relative to other buildings and spaces, like within your portfolio? And that's where we think this starts to get very interesting, is essentially designing a system that allows you to understand comparatively how one space is performing relative to other spaces of a similar type, which is why you're seeing sort of Emre comment on the performance relative to other collaboration related spaces. That's like a sliver of what happens when you do benchmarking. And we think it's really powerful because creating that connective tissue between that space and other collaboration spaces means that you can compare that space relative to other spaces that are not on this floor, that are also labeled collaboration. That's really exciting, because that's the connective tissue between spaces that you know exists, that our customers know exist, but that systems like this don't realize. And so that's what we mean by benchmarking, is essentially the connective tissue between space types.
And what's interesting, as you use, and we'll have a beta program for this. So if you're on here and you're a density customer, let us know, and we'll add you to the beta. What's interesting about this is, like, the more you label spaces or the more various people in your organization label these spaces with things like Zoom enabled, or this is space that we intend for focused work or collaboration, the richer insights that you're able to pull out of the system. And so the idea of this is, like, you can be in one region of a company that may have millions of square feet of real estate, and your workplace teams may be tagging or labeling your spaces in a particular office. And that data that team provides will actually be able to inform workplace design completely on the other side of the world, maybe for similar teams or for similar types of spaces. And so we're kind of building this connective tissue in a world where previously these studies have been, focused in one office or focused in one space. And it's almost like this growing data set where workplace teams across the company or real estate teams across the company can take advantage of the work their peers are doing in one system, which really enriches the data we provide. Because ultimately for us, like the data that the density sensor provides, whether you're solving for the portfolio workplace, only matters in the context of the company, in the context of the humans that are in that space. So if we label these spaces as sales, the types of learnings we'll derive is vastly different than just raw data about how the space is being used.
Yeah. So, like, not to be overly critical of ourselves, but like, people count is boring by itself. But it's really interesting in the context of other information. And so we want to make it really easy for users to essentially provide context about where this is, what it's related to, how it's connected, who's assigned to this space, so that we can start to give you essentially interesting outcomes about how these spaces are being used relative to the context they're in. Also, one quick note, the more you use density, the more value you should get. And so we are, like, really maniacally focused on building a fast and simple navigation system through all of your space, however small or however big your deployment may be. A fast and simple and hopefully fun labeling system that allows you to provide context into each of these spaces. And ultimately then surfacing benchmarking data so that you can understand the connective tissue between these spaces. Because the thing is, all this already exists, right? Like, humans are voting with their feet and using these spaces or not using these spaces. We're just, like, unearthing those stories, like all these buildings have stories, and, like, this is essentially a way to, like, unearth them and make them explicit, as opposed to subjective or observed, and queryable for all time in history. I mean, that's the other thing. Can you go back to the heat map for a second, yeah. Emre? What Emre, I don't think, did, which is, like, the killer feature of heat map. And so, I'll rate him later about this, but I even forgot about this, is the timeline. Like, you literally can replay the day, any day, at any speed, if you have measured. And that is probably, can you click out of the room? Actually, just click away from the, So you can replay the entire floor plan or a specific room over time. And to a person's question about, like, can you look at this over a month and a quarter? The answer is, absolutely. The goal is to give you essentially whatever perspective or zoom, like, lens you want to look at it, whether it's a day or it's a week or it's a month, or it's a quarter, or it's multi-year. You should be able to ask sort of the basic and fundamental questions of use about your space.
Building on this idea too, like, one of the ideas that like, to this point of labeling that we're focused on for next year is, like, as you play this day, Andrew mentioned earlier, like, I think there was an offsite in the space on this day. And so one concept that we're really fascinated by too is being able to annotate events in time. So you may have spaces like this conference room where a certain person like me, I'm in the office today, I know what's going on in this conference room, and we're holding an offsite. And so I should be able to annotate that happened for this interval in this space. And then anyone else at our organization should be able to use that insight or take advantage of that insight that's kind of layered on top of this historical playback or timeline.
Yeah. So can you actually go back to the other interface? Yeah.
Let's do it.
What Emre is talking about, for anybody who is a space nerd, we are internally calling space time, which is just like the ability to label space over a particular period of time. It's extremely exciting to be able to say, like, during this period, like that room that we showed you, that was an offsite. And if we can create common language around this type of stuff, we can actually show you where these things, like where these notes overlap, where there's maybe a word cloud of stuff that's happening in the space. I can imagine sort of all sorts of different interesting ways to visualize what is going on in these spaces, provided you provide context about the space that you're managing.
And what's interesting about that is, like, people are already doing that in every organization we talk to, but they're doing that through emails or anecdotal conversations, or very late in the process of reviewing a report where like one person in the room might have some insight as to what was going on, or maybe there was an all hands that way that day, and that's why the building felt super full. So it's not like groundbreaking that there's all this information scattered in an organization around how people are using space. We just want to bring that into a queryable, really easy to use system over the next several months to just make it easier for people to take advantage of it.
There's a good question about space types being defined by density or being defined by customers. So we have an interesting debate internally. The tools that we're showing you here are extensions of the tools that we use internally as we're setting up spaces, meaning the end state should be that users use the same tools that density uses to navigate, understand, and label and whatnot, space types. There are a core set of space types that we think are lingua franca, like common to the workplace and real estate industry. We're going to support all of those. And then we have some like interesting ideas around giving the user the ability to not only decide which of those types they label a particular space with, like you should be able to do whatever you want with that, but also like maybe the terms we're less familiar with, or the terms that are specific to region, or the terms that are specific to industry. And that category should allow users to essentially contribute concepts or common concepts that can be then broadly applied by other team members who are working in the same space, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel constantly. And then that's the last piece, which is the more we can encourage consistency in use, consistency in labeling, meaning someone says Zoom and the other one says Zoom room. Those are both Zoom rooms. They're both Zoom related rooms. So long as we know that those two things are the same, we can compare them. If we don't know that they're the same, then the system's going to not compare them, which is why we want to encourage users to use a common language, but we want it to be flexible enough that it can be extensible enough that it can be expanded.
The other thing that I think is interesting in some of the research we've done around this is different teams at a company may have different ways of categorizing their spaces. Like on one team may think about individual spaces versus group spaces, and how are those two performing. A workplace team focused on a particular office may care more about the team allocations in that space and what teams are assigned to what zones, and those zones may have desks and soft seating, conference rooms. And so the nice part of having like a standard way to set up functions and add labels that can be shared across the organization is you can then kind of filter down and look at how space is being used, the language that your team may be using, or the language that your company may be using, or the language that all companies we work with are using across the board. So that's kind of the trade-off between enforcing a certain structure and allowing for custom labels.
There's another question about sort of planned use versus actual use. And so actually, so the short answer is like, or the question is, can you determine what's used relative to what was reserved? Like ghost meetings, for instance, ghost spaces or whatever. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is it sort of depends on like the software that you use to do reservations. So there are some like common systems that are used for reservations. There's also some custom and bespoke systems used for reservations. And then we even have our own system that we provide to customers called Workplace, which is which is largely the result of Emre's previous company. So Emre was the CEO and founder of a company called Nashi, and they decided to join Density. Nashi decided to join Density back in, I guess, July, a little bit earlier than July of this year. And that's how Emre and I sort of got to work together. That product is called Workplace. And Workplace allows you to assign space, Workplace teams to assign space to specific teams, engineering, operations, finance, marketing. And it also allows end occupants to reserve desks that they would like to use. So what's so cool is that like with Density's measurement system and Workplace or Nashi's reservation system, you can do a full closed loop, right? You can do a full like, was it reserved and then not used? Was it not reserved but used? And so forth. And there's no reason, we're agnostic to sort of reservation system. I'd say we're happy to try to integrate that with whatever your primary reservation system is.
I think that's where like Density as a platform for understanding how space is used should enable not just closing the loop between like someone reserving a space and their intent and how it was actually used, but we also, something we didn't talk about is enabling employee experiences in the space, given the kind of sensing infrastructure that's already there that can cater to a variety of use cases. Some teams in a really crowded office where there's neighborhoods may need to book into space and reserve space. And in that case, we should be able to show intent versus what actually happened in the system that you use to manage that. In other scenarios, you might want to just have open spaces where employees can walk into an office, almost like Google Maps, see what are the hot spots on the floor plan, see a screen that shows available spaces on the floor, might have nudges, just like if you're looking at a coffee shop on Google Maps of when a certain space tends to be free and tends to be busy, and then kind of consume or navigate the space that way. And so the way we kind of think about it is like there's no one right way for employees or humans to kind of use space. We want to basically take advantage of being able to measure it in real time and unlock these different use cases on top. And obviously, really key piece is being able to integrate that into the surfaces you're already using, or your employee base is already using to book space or to find available space or to message their teammates and plan a visit to the office.
Yeah. And I should say like the product experience is very cool. Emre can decide whether or not he wants to show you like this very cool Slack integration, but you essentially can like very quickly determine for any office that you sort of belong to, who else is coming in at the same day, or which days they're coming in that week. It's very cool. There's sort of a question about can we detect coats and laptops and sort of other things? The answer is no, and that is by design. So there are a number of different systems that will take the low res camera companies that I talked to you about, the optical sensors that I talked about earlier. A number of them have products, or they sort of refer to it as signs of life. And what that means is like they'll take a photograph of whether or not your laptop is there, or whether or not your coat is there, or if like you have papers on your desk. Our general philosophy on this is that the concept of signs of life invites essentially a visibility into someone's workstation and what they're doing in a way that can ultimately hit legal or liability concerns. If you can determine like what stuff is on a desk, That means it's not a far cry to move into other things like being able to see what people are working on or what they type into a computer and so forth. And so we try to opt out of that entirely. We don't really want to look at the stuff that you've brought with you. And so we've designed a system that literally can't. We only measure the human presence, human movement and use. We do not look for stuff. And honestly, like, there's some very cool and creative things that you can do if you can like take photographs of like the stuff that's on people's desks. And it's just not something that we do. So if that's something that you're looking to achieve, that we can make some recommendations. There's some awesome companies that sort of have that capability. They do require a camera. It's sort of like the one thing to sort of one of the constraints to work within. And then there's another question about once a customer has data or insights about their space, how do they then use the data to change their existing layout or portfolio? Is Density making or facilitating those recommendations, or is that on the customer to take the data and run with it? And I'll let Emre kind of take this, but I'd say my take on it is that it depends on the sophistication of or size of the team relative to the size of the portfolio. So what usually we see is like smaller teams with, say, 1 million square feet of space or a couple 100,000 square feet of space. You know, they're growing really rapidly, but they might have a really small, like 4 or 5 person team. Those folks, because of like the scope, they might be able to just manage all of it internally. They don't need, they've got their own process. They just need the data to make decisions about how to grow quickly and how to map their, with this great recommendation from one of our customers who said, I want to map my headcount plans with a predictive system for square footage that I will need by region. That is a eminently doable thing, you know, putting in your headcount plans, context, headcount growth relative to actual use in those regions, and then Density providing some predictive recommendation of where you might need to grow and by how much. Totally something that should be within the ballpark this year. However, depending on how big that organization is and how sophisticated the workplace and real estate team is, you might have a dozen folks working the problem and partnered with a CBRE and maybe some of the other providers to inform them on business strategy, real estate strategy every quarter or every month. Those tend to be operations where you're dealing with, you know, 40, 50, 60, 100 million square feet of space. And in that case, like, we're not going to tell that customer, here's what you need to do with 10 million square feet of space, but we can certainly inform the folks that are having the discussion with data about how that space is being used. So the answer is more nuanced than just we tell you what to do or we don't. It is that, you know, Density tries to provide sort of like direct recommendations if we can. But the reality is that like these teams are, they're experts in this. You know, we're experts in the technology trying to solve autonomous measurement. These teams are experts in their own space and in what to do with real estate. We just want to give them better data.
I think one idea we talk about a lot, and our colleague Nelly calls this like red flags and green flags. Like one thing we want to be able to unlock in the software and do places and do more of this in the coming month is like, how do we surface things that are out of the ordinary to you as a user? Like if you're looking at the building level, if the number of people in the building is suddenly spiking to a level that it wasn't over the past 90 days or the past few months, or if there's a conference room that's just getting such heavy usage relative to all the other similar conference rooms, or a neighborhood that's not being used as much as other neighborhoods. And so that's how we think about recommending and giving users insights in our software is like, we just make it easier to point out these anomalies and then let you annotate and label and give context and then share that out within your organization. So that's just kind of another layer on the recommendation side.
We're going to need to wrap. Yeah, we're going to need to wrap soon.
Yeah. So we'll kind of, there are also questions, so many coming in, and we're happy to also just answer any of these offline. maybe we can do just one more. So there's one question on when we think about performance, just consider utilization and how does qualitative information come in to make spaces better. And so maybe just a quick answer on that one. There's definitely quantitative and qualitative information that's necessary to understand how a space is performing. And so for us on the quantitative side, it's like utilization, occupancy, dwell time, the time, percent of the time the space is used over the time interval that you're looking at, and benchmarking those metrics. And then there's this qualitative information, and that's where we talk about labeling or annotating in space time, like what happened in the space for a given period. And our goal is very much to merge those two together.
I want to do maybe just like some rapid fire items. We don't distinguish between children and adults. I think someone asked that question. Range and depth of detection depends on your space type and your ceiling heights, to be honest, with open area. So I would just say it's something that as you get into working with us, you'll get a deployment plan that shows you exactly the number of devices required for your particular space type. This range is really widely because spaces could be 7 feet, they could be 12 feet. Security, what is the highest level of product security does your product hardware contain? What I can say is number one, because we're anonymous at source, we can go into places that are hyper secure. And number two, we have been through multiple extraordinary, they're called destructive penetration tests, where someone literally takes a device and like goes through destructive intrusion, like they are trying to like break into the system. And the general feedback has been, you all might be more paranoid than we are. And we're a very paranoid bunch. So I would just say the general feedback is like, we care very deeply about security. Now, security is a moving target, meaning it's like something that you just actively have to work on at all times, which is one of the reasons why we operate a full system, like a fully embedded system that we do over the air updates and patches for. But it's an awesome system. Let's see. We don't do unique person separation. We're not going to like say that is Emre and this is Andrew. We will do, there are two people there and they are bumping into one another and they're talking for a while, or they seem to be with one another for a while. But we don't do and cannot do, sensing system literally cannot do unique identification of humans, which is very much by design. We would really love to live in a world that doesn't result in accidental mass surveillance. We would love to sort of like invest in infrastructure where when we are deploying and designing systems, we design them when there's a user has a reasonable expectation of privacy. And I promise we're going to wrap in a minute, a reasonable expectation of privacy, that we do not deploy a system that can invade that privacy for autonomous measurement. Security is a different matter, right? Like deploying cameras for security purposes inside offices makes a ton of sense. But when it's used for active measurement, when it's used for active surveillance, that's when it starts to wander into territory that is honestly, it's something that each company and culture has to wrestle with. Are we willing to take on the liability, or is this something that we really don't want to have sort of as infrastructure? And that's a decision that's unique to each culture. I am not anti-camera. I actually think there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with cameras. We just believe that, we think we can derive really high quality and in some cases substantially more accurate outcomes with a less intrusive system. And that's where we try to focus our time and attention. I've tried to address all of the questions. It's really important. There's a lot of them. It's really important that we try to be transparent with folks. So if we didn't get to your question, please don't hesitate to reach out to sort of our general email. You can also always send me an email. My team's going to kill me for giving you my email, but it's just Andrew@Density. Pretty easy to guess. If you send me a note, I will try to get back to you, but I would say at the very least, if you have questions, we will try to address them directly. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to let Emre close, but thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone. Andrew, thank you, and our team for setting this up. Just one note, if any of this is interesting to you from we want to use this in our space perspective, or we want to help design it, definitely reach out. We're also hiring a bunch of different folks across product and design and engineering and go-to-market. So on that front too, if you want to work on problems like this, we'd love to talk to you too. So with that, please enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays, and see you soon on our next session that we do. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
See you.